Hello, I'm Robert Lyle, the General Director of the New Orleans Opera, and we are proud to be hosting this important national tour of the Breaking Glass Forum. And we are at Xavier University, and I want to introduce the moderator of this panel, Mr. Matthew Morrison.
Hello, welcome. Perfect timing. Hello, welcome to our Breaking Glass, Glimmer Glass Festival celebration today. My name is Matthew Morrison. I am an assistant professor at the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music at New York University, and we are very excited to present to you all today. So on behalf of the Glimmer Glass Festival in Cooperstown, New York, our partners are the New Orleans Opera and our host is Xavier University of Louisiana. Thank you for being a part of Breaking Glass, a national series of forums curated by Glimmer Glass, focusing not only on racism and discrimination in opera, but also uncovering ways that the inclusion and social change can be made through engaging whole communities to tell stories that matter to them. Breaking Glass, Hyperlinking Opera and Issues is funded in part by a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. By commissioning 2 new operas, Stomping Grounds in 2017 and Blue in 2019, which both highlight issues of race, gentrification, and police violence inflicted on the African American family, Glimmer Glass is opening a dialogue, like today's forum, to its extended national community. We are thrilled and thankful for the participation of Terrence Blanchard to speak with all of us today, while in the middle of 2 performances of his new opera, Champion, which if you did not see last night in its premiere, it performs again tomorrow afternoon at 2:30 p.m. at the Mahalia Jackson Theater here in New Orleans. We would like to send a special thanks to Xavier University Theater staff for helping with our technical production today, and also to Robert Lyle, the General and Artistic Director of the New Orleans Opera, and his incredible staff, who clearly have a passion for modern and relevant storytelling, much like Glimmer Glass. So again, we're very excited to present this forum to you today. I myself, as an alum of Morehouse College, am excited to be in the space of Xavier University with the rich history that it carries, both for classical music traditions and a number of different Black music tradition styles too. And so I'm very happy to be able to be a part of this extremely powerful panel of composers, librettists, and directors. And so we have here to my right, Paige Hernandez, who is the choreographer, librettist, and director for Stomping Grounds. To my left, we have Terrence Blanchard, who is the composer for Champion. And on Skype, we have Janine Tesori, who is the librettist for Blue. Well, Janine will join us soon, electronically. We know how these technologies work, but I'm sure she'll be with us soon. Thanks very much. So each of these forums, they're all designed, this is a series of tours in which we're having discussions around these 2 operas to really try to expand the conversation for how we might think about inclusion within the operatic world, one that often is not inclusive of those who, of people of color in particular, and other disenfranchised groups of people. And so it's also a special opportunity for us to include Terrence Blanchard as part of this conversation with Glimmer Glass, since his opera is, which is dealing with very real and also intense issues around Black life, specifically in the life of the boxer there through Champion. And so it's really wonderful to be in dialogue with living composers and librettists and directors who are trying to figure out how does one really engage with these topics and the directions that one might go, especially within institutions of classical music, again, that are looking for ways to, in some cases, be more inclusive. And so one of the things that is also unique about this particular form is that all of our opera composers and directors, librettists, and choreographers are engaging in these particular operas are their first ventures in the genre themselves. Now, they all are well versed in a number of different musical mediums, and so it's really interesting to be able to have a conversation about the ways in which these very stellar artists are able to bring a unique and new perspective to expanding on the canon of classical opera as well. And so we also want to consider what is unique about the approach that these creators take to setting these topics, especially topics dealing directly with African American life in particular, for an operatic stage, to consider the medium, what the medium of the operatic stage is, how it can be used as a mode for effectively communicating the stories of people of color and many others to a mostly white operatic audience houses, and how do we also hope to change the demographics of these spaces over time to be more inclusive. And we also want to make sure that in this forum that we take into consideration the politics and challenges of blurring the distinctions between theatrical styles. And so we often, at Xavier, I'm sure within the music department, we understand the ways that ideologically classical music traditions are often separated between high and low art falsely, right? And this also sets up for different styles to seem to have certain hierarchies in musical traditions. And so I think what our composers and directors and artists here are doing are breaking down these distinctions, also something that musicians have done over time. And we now have Janine Tesori, who has joined us. Again, Janine, thank you very much.
Hi.
Who is a composer for Blue. Okay. And so actually I would like to, since Janine is here with us, why don't we move through, and I would like to ask Janine to talk with us a little bit about the opera Blue. Give us, Janine, a brief synopsis, as well as a sort of introduction about where you are in the process of composing the work. And then if you can set up the excerpt, go figure, that our soloist, Christina Hicks, will sing for us today.
The Opera Blue was it's a commission from Cheska for Glimmerglass and the WNO, based on the story. It's it's somewhat nonfiction about an officer of the law. It's a sort of a composite figure that Tazewell Thompson, who the librettist, knew. And Tazewell was at first, we wanted to write a story about a family, and he had certain ideas about plays that I didn't want to continue the sort of, I wasn't interested in. And then he thought, oh, let's write a story about an African-American man, and make him a musician. And I thought, you know what, I don't know guys like that anymore. When I first started in the business, I sort of knew some guys who were gigging like that, but I don't know them anymore. I was really interested in the idea of, I met a police commissioner when I was doing some community organizing, and he was really interested in hearing the very, very complicated stories about his family and his relationship with his son. As a Black officer of the law, the son that there was so much strife with, and the daughter who adored him. And so I asked Tazewell about that, and he thought that was his first reaction was really that he wasn't sure that he could do it because he had so many complicated feelings himself about that. But then he did, and he wrote this beautiful libretto that I'm completely behind with, and it tells the story of how, that these people, their relationships inside their community, represented by 3 girlfriends and then 3 other, the birth of their son. And then it ends with the scene at the end of the act of when the son is 16, and this incredible strife and confusion and conflict that father and son have and their incredible love for each other and what they represent to each other, because the son at 16 is really politically active, and he sees his father as the hero, as the enemy, as the solution, as the problem. And I was really interested in the strata of all of those, not just one thing, not just the trope of the aggression of a father and son, but this, adolescence as I have observed it and seen it with my own child. So I'm basically done with Act One, and this scene, Go Figure, is, I had heard stories, I only bear witness to them as a person not of color. I feel like my job is to forward these streams as responsibly as possible, with knowing that I can't possibly do anything but hold space for the stories and try to reveal them as best I can. And Tazewell and I spoke to many people in his conversations about how people in his community, when there was a woman who had said when she was going to have a baby boy that there was a sort of silence in the room. And in other communities, there's great joy. As an Italian, that's what you want. You want a boy. There's this thing that you eat more broccoli and you get a boy. And my father, I'm one of 4 girls, so clearly there wasn't enough broccoli in our house. But that there was this sort of, a silence around that. And she tells her girlfriends in this scene that she's not only married and pregnant, but that she's going to have a boy, and that the father is a cop, and he much prefers the term officer of the law. This man who we're basing this on does not like that term cop. And so there's this stunned silence about, and her girlfriends are saying, what? Not a doctor, not a lawyer, not a community organizer, the head of a megachurch. And, she's so in love with this man who is so in love with her. So this aria is really about the space of love that this woman holds and the way that she is seen by this man. That was a lot of talking.
He seems to love me more than I love him.
Thank you so much, Christina, for that very moving performance of Hello, My Son. Again, composed by Janine Tesori, and the book and librettist Tazewell Thompson, who is not present today, but we miss him. We'll see him again soon. So Janine, if you can, thank you again for regularly sharing this work with us, and the sort of clear effort and energy put towards in some way conveying the intense pathos of the narrative here. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about, again, as entering into the space of composing for the for opera as theater, and coming from theater, you know, having been a Tony Award-winning composer for Fun Home in 2015. I wonder if you can say just a bit more to us about some of the choices that you made compositionally to set this text in particular or other parts, and then also how those choices were informed again what I think by what I think you pointed out to be this very important sort of recognition of your placehood in relation to the stories that you're telling, right? And so, you know, how were you moving through the compositional process on its own in relation to how you were thinking through ways to convey the story and narrative of a group and of a person that you could find a relation to, but who also had their own individual sort of experience and background?
Well, first of all, I want to say it's such an honor to be on this panel, even by remote, even inside a TV. You know, I love Champion, and I'm hearing Stomping Grounds for the first time because I didn't get to see it. Made me, you know, every time I'm on a panel, I'm sort of amazed at the way that we move forward, because we as artists, we're in our own little ice cube trays. You know, I'm in my writing room, and as soon as I'm done with this, I go wrestle with the writing pad and enter into this stew of self-doubt about why I'm doing this. So it's wonderful to hear how, you know, to hold the space for other artists, because, you know, I sat in the audience at Champion, and I was like, how did he do that? How did that work? And now I get to hear it, because you can only, that's the beauty of this is the crosstalk. So I just wanted to say that the honor is really mine. You know, I think that opera, for me, I wrestle with the forms, because when I did Caroline or Change, and people are like, what is it? What do you call it? I was like, I'm not interested in what we call it. It is a very boring conversation to me. Is it opera? Is it this? It's like, does it move you? Is it funny? Is it compelling? Then call it pepperoni. It doesn't matter. I think I write sopra, which to me, my obsession is to tell stories, to transform the way that people see the sky when they come out of the theater. So that, I feel like I was not put on the earth to write a hit show, because I have to write so much. It's just the way it is, and I accept it because I love it. I'm very interested in revealing the stories of people who are not usually told inside the national narrative. A 1963, a maid in a Jewish household, you know, a butch or as a boy woman as a protagonist inside musical theater. You know, these kinds of stories, to me, deserve to be in the repertoire, and they deserve to be sung in a way. And I feel like I'm only now at age 56 just understanding the way that narrative hits music, because they're both slippery, and metaphor on stage as it can stand one for all, the universality of it, which is not quite true when it comes to invisible stories. It should be true, but it's not. That is a very worthy thing to me to sort of investigate, to use. I guess the thing that I struggle with, I was doing a story about Liberian opera, and I was meeting with a lot of Liberians, and they said, why would you do this? What gives you the right? And I said, I don't. And yet, if I don't do it, I don't see it happening, this particular story. But it is real. That conversation has to happen about how you flow in and flow out, because you know, you have to make space that trained that people are telling their own stories. And it's interesting because I have yet to tell an Italian story. and I'm gearing up for one. I don't know what it is yet. But I think the thing that I really love, first of all, what I love about opera is I do love the range to me of the voices, the training of the voices, this Herculean strength of, you know, you just heard it in that beautiful singer. Out of these lobes of your lungs comes this force above the orchestra that feels epic to me and mythic. You can go to the range of all human emotions. And in theater, I have to hold myself back from using dissonance in a way, because the ears are not, you know, there's just so far that I can push that in a sense. When I was writing Little Mermaid 3, because I wrote Disney for a while, and a friend of mine, I was like, God, I wish this story were more complicated. He said, what are you gonna do? Have her find a barnacle on her breast? It's Little Mermaid 3. There's just so much that you can do. And I thought, that's right, it's a vessel. It can hold just so much. And I think theater music is true, but for me, for opera, when you look from Berg to Janacek to Blanchard to you're just like, oh, it can hold anything you can dream of. It can hold anything. And so I feel like I finally in opera have the freedom to go as high and as low and as long and as round as the orchestra can contain. And when you have the story of a Black officer of the law and the tragedy that befalls not on stage but intermission about him losing his child, I think that you really have to go there, because I think it's the part of the national conversation that is of the loss of a child, the debt of this society, the trail of tears, and these voices about how you move forward. Again, that comes from me from observation, not from a first hand. So it's tender land, it's tender going for me about how I discuss it, because I don't own it. It is not my own narrative. I'm but a visitor. And that's why I appreciate the panels, because mostly what I'm here to do is listen more than speak.
Thank you so much for that, Jean, and that's a really good segue into, I think, a question that I can also ask of our panelists who are here with us in person as well, Terrence and Paige. And so this idea that you brought up, Jean, and I always appreciate sort of your very candid discussion of the very real challenges and also what it means to be aware of one's positionality, right? And I think that's just something that within the art and creative space, depending especially within classical Western music, these are challenges that we find ourselves, conversations rather, that we often find ourselves not having on a regular, and also not central to the way in which these institutions function. And so I think what is very instructive about the Glimmerglass Forum itself is to really lay bare and place on the table what the creative, artistic, and collaborative challenges are, because they also show what can come from these challenges, and not just things that are limiting in some way, but also can produce new possibilities and things that are outside of the more traditional ways and approaches and narratives that we find ourselves within opera. And so with that being said, I would like to, in addition to Paige's, to Janine's thoughts and comments, to ask Terrence and Paige as well, what are both some of the possibilities and challenges that you find in being composers, and specifically composers for the operatic stage, in communicating, whether it's through choreography or the text, right, or through the actual sounds that animate the performance there? What are some of the possibilities and challenges that you found in your approach to writing for opera and theater in this way? I wonder, maybe you can start.
Hi, everybody. My name is Paige Hernandez again, and I'm the librettist, director, and choreographer of Stomping Grounds, a hip opera, which we'll see a bit of in a few minutes. But to address your question, yes, you know, what Janine said was really interesting, just about kind of the limitations that we're in, depending on the field that we started in. For me, it was theater, starting first as a performer and then as a playwright, and then being asked to write an opera, which premiered last summer. So this is my first opera, my first libretto, and what that means and what those challenges are and how we, pretty much fly by the seat of your pants, A lot of it is when I was asked to be commissioned to write an opera, no one gave me a crash course on opera. It wasn't like, check out these other librettos, check out these other hip operas, because they don't exist, right? Well, maybe there's 2 or 3. So yeah, it's like, okay, well then I have to bring to the table what I'm an expert in, which for me is hip hop. I'm a B-girl through and through. I wrote the entire opera in verse, which means the entire thing rhymes from top to bottom. And also, like what Janine said, I wanted to see things I hadn't seen yet, which meant a strong woman of color as the lead character who's not hypersexual, grounded. So all of these different things came to play, but I'll talk about that later. But yeah, and for me as a dancer, it was also important to communicate the physicality of opera. I was warned of the park and bark, which is that opera singers, find a place and they sing to the back of the house or wherever the conductor might be. And I really challenged my performers, which you'll see a part of, to move, to dance. That didn't mean 5, 6, 7, 8. It just meant being able to dig deep and find that intention in just a gesture, in a movement, in the way that they interact with the other performers on stage. So it was really great to be able to bring several different intersections to my piece. So not just the hip hop and the opera, but also the movement aspect as well as my theatrical background.
Well, let me say it's also to an honor to be on this panel with Janine and Paige, because this is also new to me. I'm a newcomer to this, and I think the most important thing about what it is that we do, and we've been talking about it with the principals in this production, is stop thinking about opera. Tell stories. That's what we want to do. And when Janine was talking about it, I was nodding my head because the opera world, I think, in some regards, suffers from the same thing that the jazz world suffers from, takes itself too seriously sometimes. And when it does that, that means that there are current events and relative ideas and storylines that they will not want to examine because it doesn't fall into a narrative of what they perceive opera to be or have been. And I think our challenge is that we are people who are very conscious. Obviously, if you listen to these 2 women speak, and we can't run from that, like you were saying. Of course, I feel, like I'm out in the middle of the ocean. I love Janine's thing when she says, as soon as I'm getting off of this thing, I'm going back to a room of self-doubt. I know exactly what that room looks like. Yeah, I know exactly what it looks like. But the thing about it, though, the self-doubt, I think, is the thing that helps propel the honesty in what it is that you do. Because I've been telling my students, throw away the idea of what you think opera is. Because one of the things about those classic operas that all of the great classics is that they were written and they were documentation from the time of the period that they were written in. And we've come to memorialize that thing in such a way that we don't want to hear other stories. And it's unfortunate because we are living in a time where there are a lot of stories that need to be told. And one of the beautiful things about this panel is that you have 3 very distinct visions of those things. It shouldn't be a narrow thing, because I'm learning to listen to 2 women talk about wanting to have a female protagonist. And just as you said that, I went, oh, right, I haven't seen that. And to have Janine say, I don't own this issue. But just because she may not own it doesn't mean she doesn't have a right to give her opinion or have her view of it. As a matter of fact, I was submitted to be the opposite. We all need to have our views heard about these issues so we can have honest dialogue and create a space where everybody could come to it and say, we need to start learning how to celebrate our differences and understand that we're all human. And then the piece that I did with Champion, that's one of the things, that we kept talking about, because everybody wants to label it a boxing opera, and it's not. It's not a boxing. Boxing is the backdrop to the story of this man who was struggling with his own identity and struggling with his sexuality, and how do I come out, or do I come out and deal with this in the public, and to have somebody make that decision for him, and how he reacted to it is what this whole thing is about, and how he had to forgive himself for not only what happened in the ring, but just forgive himself in terms of not really accepting himself who he is. All of those are very valid stories to be told, and the evidence is in the response from the people who come to the performances. And I know you guys probably have similar experiences where people come to the performance and they're in tears because they're finally seeing themselves on stage. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we talk about it in my film career all the time, to see yourself on, I don't want to belabor the point, but look at Black Panther. I mean, just step out of the opera world for a second. That thing has had such an impact because people are seeing themselves on stage, on screen, in a very positive, very powerful and commanding way. And that's to me the power of opera, because we had so many people last night who came to the performance who had never been to opera before. And there were some young students from Xavier that came, and I was really impressed with them, because not only did they come, but they were moved by the experience. So now that we have them, let's not let them go. Now that they have an interest, for them, I'm glad it was Champion, but it could be Blue, it could be any other thing. But soon as they get caught by that, now I'm using myself weak, this is the first time I'm doing this, I'm starting to accept that I am part of the opera community. Yeah. It's new for me, trust me. It's like getting married at the beginning of it. It's like, oh, I do have a wife. But we as a community need to figure out, okay, well, what's the next story? What's the next thing that we need to go out and do to keep these people interested? Not the people who come all the time. That's preaching to the choir. It's like I said in my jazz career, one of the things that I hate is when I get reviewed in all of the magazines that review us anyway. That doesn't spread the message. The message needs to go beyond the realm of what it is that we do. And there are powerful stories to be told, like we all know. And I feel fortunate enough to start to see people like us in a room having these discussions, because it's really important to get that message out. And not only to the opera community, but to the artists. I think it's important, because I think what Janine said is very, very, and what you said, we all feel like fish out of water, but that doesn't mean we don't belong.
Thank you all very much for that. Janine.
This is my third time at the rodeo.
Oh, it's your third opera. Oh, so pardon my misspeak there. Your third opera, gotcha.
I have the scars to prove it.
Paige, if we can just sort of stay in this lane here where we are, and also give you space, or open the space rather, for you to give us a little bit more background on Stomping Grounds, and then also set up the. We actually do have. Pardon me. That was, yes. Thank you. This is a collaborative effort, even among the moderators. So as Janine. So we actually have a second excerpt, fortunately from Blue, "Hello, My Son," which will be sung by Ivan Griffin. And Janine, do you want to give us just a very brief setup for this scene? Thank you.
This is in scene 2. This is the first time that this father, this young cop is. Thank you, Paige. This is the first time that this father is holding his baby boy, and there's a whole scene with the nurse that the baby is placed in his hands, and there's a whole scene where he won't take it and he's holding it. The first time you hold a baby, it's like, well, what the hell is this? And what do I do with it? And then through the course of the opera, he finally starts to relax in holding this little baby. It's the first time that he sings right to his son, who was just born the day before.
My son, my baby boy, you are my son, you make me cry, didn't want to have you, now for you I'd die. Oh, your mama's mouth. Oh, you have my nose. You've got all your little fingers. I've counted all your toes. I love your seashell ears. I love your wisp of hair. Your big brown eyes that seem to stare. With little fingers you grasp my thumb. Everything inside of me grows numb. My son, my little baby boy, my all the world, my pride and joy. Oh, what a gift, so rare, so sweet, so fine. You bring our lives a lift, no rift between us now. He's yours, he's ours, he's mine. Oh, what a gift, so rare, so sweet, so fine. Let's start a promise that we will never part, and twine this child within our hearts. He's yours, he's ours, he's mine. My child, my boy, my son is
Thank you again very much, Mr. Ivan Griffin, for that rendition of My Son from Blue. And so, Janine, I think that we are unfortunately going to, are you going to stick around with us for the remainder, or are you?
Oh, yeah, I'm going to
Okay, great. So I just want to give you a chance to give any closing thoughts on Blue, and if there's anything else that you wanted to add around My Son in particular.
You know, I think it's really interesting. When I was starting to write, I write a lot about women's relationships to their fathers, because they're not, when you think about it. And I was looking at musical theater, and there were no stories about women with their fathers, because they traditionally have not been written by women. They've been written by men. So there are a lot of relationship stories between men and their fathers, all of the O'Neill cycles. And I also, in terms of the national conversation of the violence that's happened, police brutality, and the complications of being an officer of color, I really wanted to understand and see on stage the unbelievable love between a father and son, so that we understand that at the end of these acts of violence, what's dangling at the end of political decisions are human beings. And that is, to me, why we tell the story. And I think you know, when I watched Champion and when I've seen what of Stomping Grounds is, out of these political pieces of paper and legislation dangles the lives of people. And that's the politics of it. And it's not until, I think the reason why they are so moving to me is, as we said, it's not, if we say that's a boxing opera, it's from people's need to put some distance between the thing and themselves. It is an opera about one person's struggle with, to me, about people's need to name him something so that they can distance themselves from him, as opposed to we fight for our lives and to be who we are. We are all in that ring. That is the point to me, for me, in that story. And I joined with an incredibly inclusive audience when I saw that at WNO. It was such a great joy. Young, old, black, white. It was unbelievable. And I thought, could this, if every opera audience looked like this, we would understand more about each other. Don't call it a boxing opera. It is a story about being alive. So I think that to me is the endless, music is oceanic. There is no mastering it. There's only enjoying the ride and being curious about the journey. And so you know, I'm trying to write the thing I want to see, as the great writer said.
Thank you so much, Janine. Paige, I'm wondering if you can give us again a little insight into the story that you're sharing here, and so again we're talking about untold stories that are untold not because they don't exist, but because there are specific systems and structures, systematic structures of power, like racism and like classism and like sexism and like all these other things that that silence stories to be told. And so if you can say a little bit more about what story you're telling, because you're telling many stories, right, in Stomping Ground. And then if you can also set up the two clips that we'll be viewing after.
Great. So, yes, Stomping Grounds is the story of home to, from, and away from home, which in the story is told by natives, refugees, immigrants, and descendants of slaves. Originally, when I was commissioned, it was to talk about the refugee experience coming out of Syria, which I couldn't really speak to. I'm a Baltimore native, I'm outside of DC, so I tried to think about how can I find a way to tell this story to do it justice if I was speaking about a population or a demographic that I wasn't that familiar with. And really, I just had to look in the mirror, or as we say in Baltimore, look in the mirror. I know that there's some family on live stream laughing at that. So my background is Black, Cuban, and Chinese. I'm more Black than anything, but I've got Cuban refugees in my lineage. I've got Chinese immigrants in my lineage. I've got descendants of slaves all over the place, all up in there. And then the natives. So being able to look at how all of these people can intersect. And for me, it was best to tell it through a metaphor, which was a coffee shop that's about to be gentrified. Because for me, what was more interesting than the actual refugee story was how we choose as not being refugees to deal or not deal with it. How do we help others in times of need, in crisis? Do we turn a blind eye? But what happens when it walks right into your room? And you have no choice but to confront it. So I wanted to write a piece that really looked at that intersectionality. And how essentially, if we all are held accountable, we can truly save each other. And that's what happens in the story. So Yessie is my strong Cuban woman lead, and her coffee shop is about to be gentrified by a really nasty African-American developer. But we find out that by shaking the ground, by stomping on the ground, she's also in a coffee shop, Coffee Grounds. She makes her coffee with chicory, which comes from the ground, which is back in her, yes, New Orleans, yes. You know, all of these things are connected. And in the libretto, I talk about that, what slaves cut their coffee with, like a New Orleans pour. That's all there, and a way to just kind of embed that history of how we're all cross-connected, mostly through the ground. Even the ground we're sitting on right now belonged to someone before us. giving those thanks, giving that praise, and knowing that we're walking in the paths of just so many things and so many different people. So anyway, an African-American developer is after her. He's like a millennial. He's, you know, an opportunist. He's on the up and up. And her tenants are just terrified because although she's in the coffee shop in the bottom, she's got tenants above her, so everybody's about to get kicked out. Everybody gets a check, but a check is a different type of displacement, right? So we talk about those. And each character in the show speaks from those different perspectives, from being a native who's been displaced before, from those who are on the run, from those who are grappling with what it means to own land, to rent land, all of those things. Ultimately, Yessie, the main character, she goes and talks to the gods, talks to the ancestors. She stomps the ground. And by stomping it, she shakes it, she steps on it, all of those things, to which she finds an artifact. And that artifact is the reason that they can't tear her coffee shop down, because it becomes a historical landmark. We find out that the artifact is a shackle from a freed slave. So her coffee shop was built on top of a burial ground for the Underground Railroad, which is prime for the Maryland, DC area, where so much of that ground is ripe with that. And they're still finding things, which is fascinating. But again, here's an ancestor from African lineage, an African American, who saved her ground. So then what she chooses to do afterwards in terms of passing that on, sharing that space, you know, whose ground do you walk on and whose ground do we deserve to be on? All those things. So that's what I explored in this libretto. The piece that you're about to see is really my attempt at really marrying hip hop with the opera. So in the actual show, we had a live DJ on stage, as well as percussionists. And the music is composed by Victor Simonson, whose Small World was the musical director for Bud Not Buddy, which is one of Terrence's pieces that were at the Kennedy Center recently. And it was really leaning on all those other musicians to really find that kind of authentic, accurate fusion. I don't even know if fusion is the right word. It might be hybrid, but I wanted each of the art forms to be equal as much as possible. So I didn't want to just do the one opera joint or the one hip hop, or, you know, I wanted them to always be present, always be equal, have those different things. And that's what I enjoyed so much about Champion last night. Just the moments when jazz was swinging. Do you know what I mean? Because I grappled with that as a hip hop artist, like, where in this opera does hip hop really shine? And this is still what I'm bringing to the table. So I want to make sure that the hip hop heads are satisfied. But then also, when is it balanced? And when do they lend themselves to each other? And when can they be on top of each other? Like that aria with the with just bass.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my goodness, I turned the mic off. Which is something I tried to accomplish. So to sit there in the seat last night and feel and experience that, I was like, oh, that's it. That's it. And it's so simple and so impactful and powerful. And there you got to see, just neck and neck, the two genres just support each other in a way that I've never even, oh, I melted. Yeah. She sings that. I mean, it steals the show. So that for me is a great example of just some of the things I tried to accomplish in the piece that you're about to see. This piece is called Uproar. I think it speaks for itself, but again, you don't see the DJ in this video, but he is literally going live to the opera. So all the boom baps are done on an MPC machine, and he's actually my little brother in real life. His name's Nick DeWanda. And I was like, that's dope. I've never seen, you know, someone do opera while someone is doing a live MPC mixing. Like, that's what excites me, and that's what I want to see, and that's the needs that I was trying to meet with this piece. So enjoy.
Survival of the fittest. This world's not sacred. War. Yes, we want war. Stand on the land and that means war. War. Yes, we want war. Stand on the land
grind, pick, select, roast, grind, sift, grind, sift, chicory, sift, grind, sift, chicory, brew, thicken, boil, white cup, brew, thicken, boil, white cup, relax, sip, swirl, relax, relax, sip, swirl, relax, last sip, wish, flip, flip, plate is home, cup is business.
Read it for me. Highs and lows, read it for me. Okay, here it goes. As for help, look to a higher spirit. All is not what it seems. I do have to reveal it. Shame on God's beneath. But I've shaken them. This agony is relentless. This reading is abstract and artist senseless. I'll stick to the court date. It'll hurl out from there. Where with you each step, you have to know we I just need rest. Gonna lock up today. Until tomorrow, friends. Please be on your way. Look to the ground and still your best bet. Look to the ground, don't give in to the threat. Look to the ground and still your best bet. Look to the ground, don't give in to the threat. Look to the ground and still your best bet. Look to the ground, don't give in to the threat. Look to the ground and still your best bet. Look to the ground, don't give in to the threat.
Thank you so much for your work on this and your collaboration with Victor Simonson. It's really there's so many things that you contributed to this work, right? So again, you're creating the book, directing, the choreography, right? And then you're also layering so many different narratives and stories and histories and geographies. I mean, you're really pulling. This is, I think, a textbook example of what it means to really just try to go there, but then also do it in the most thorough way, then also in the most honest way, right? But then there also, again, that you're making very deliberate and intentional choices that I imagine you had to think through a number of choices over the course of time, right? So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the, and also speaking in Victor's absence here, a little bit about the way in which you developed the libretto around the speaking or rapping, or even sprechstimme if you want to make it operatic, right, in a way, with this sort of complementary, more bel canto traditional style of operatic performance. And then also if you could say a little bit about the sort of inclusion of a number of African diasporic traditions within the work and how those things relate to one another for you.
Yeah, so I wrote the whole thing in verse. I'm an MC as well. I try to do all of the elements here. Break dance, graffiti, you just call on me. So actually I rapped the whole script and recorded it because I wanted it to fall in my cadences. And I knew that it was something that was going to be hard to transcribe, to put onto sheet music. And that became a big deal throughout. How much was sung, how much was spoken, and what style was it, you know? This this scene was actually inspired by Jay-Z's Encore, produced by Kanye West. So that's like, encore, do you want more? Yeah, but that's uproar. Yes, we want more. Stand on your land, and that means war. But I had to have those references at the table because the opera singers were looking at me like I was crazy. Some of them could relate, but then it was like I needed to be, and this was mostly with a collaboration with Victor too. I needed it to be those references. You know, we start the show with the Slick Rick reference, but again, it's all in the cadence of the way it's spoken, not necessarily in the exact lyric. And that was tricky too. You know, another thing that pleasantly surprised me about your piece, Terrence, is that there was amplification. Because I was like, if we got a live DJ and he's doing live 808s, which is that really heavy bass that you hear, then, you know, and they're rapping over it, they need to be able to do it. And it's a different type of projection than being able to belt out an aria. But that was an uphill battle that I had to fight, to be in kind of a purist environment where they're like, no, we don't amplify. But I was like, but we got a DJ, and there's bass and a subwoofer, and we want them to succeed, and we want for, again, the hip hop to be just as equal as the opera. So if for hip hop it needs to be amplified, then we had to find that mix. So it was a lot for the performers to be able to go from, you saw Yessie go from singing and belting into spoken word, into dance. You didn't even see the big dance number. So being able to do all of those things. African diaspora was really important to me. I could sense it. I mean, that's just what comes along with our background, with our catalog. It's just innate. It's in the blood. I really wanted to touch on very specific rhythms. So there's everything in there from the Cuban style of things with clave and things like that, but also, you know, we go Pentecostal shouting in the beginning in the first movement. So covering that whole gamut of kind of Black music, but it's also about entry points and accessibility so that there's something there for everyone. We also wanted to make sure that there was American Indian patterns present. Again, because we have a character that's specific to the American Indian. So it's being able to acknowledge all those different styles of music and just finding the best intersection through the African diaspora, which was important to me as well as the composer, Victor.
First of all, I really love that. By the way, you know, and the reason, thank you, I appreciate that. But the reason why I love it is because the more and more I think about classical music and opera and film music as well, one of the things that I think, and I'm not picking on classical music because I see the same thing in jazz, is that, you know, we tend to look at that thing in such a way and say, this is what it is, forgetting the fact that probably if Puccini had his opportunity, he would use hip hop as well. You know what I mean? Because the way that I was taught is that writing for this idiom that we're talking about is where you take folklore and expand on it. So if you're telling a story about this burial ground from the Underground Railroad underneath this coffee shop, then all of those elements should be in play. Why shouldn't they be? You're going to avoid that? Well, then you're not dealing in reality, you know. And I think the issue becomes where, because I tell my students this all the time. I said, listen, man, this is a different world just from 30, 40 years ago, creatively. You know, you cannot think of yourself as just a jazz musician anymore. Those days are gone. That's gone. You cannot just think of yourself as a classical musician. We have to encompass all of these elements. And what was really great about your piece and listening to Janine's piece as well is that I'm hearing the human spirit in all of that. It's shining through. And when you just showed us this clip, and I'm hearing those beautiful voices over the beats, over the grooves, I'm going, sounds natural to me. Doesn't sound out of place to me. It sounds like it belongs. So if it belongs, then why are we running from it? And it's people run from it because we want to stay in our safe spot. Calling it something else so you can distance yourself from it. And I look at it as like, no, that's the exact road we should be going down. You know, the issue becomes is, can you deal with it or can you understand it? Because I've been having, and I'll just say this, because bringing Roger Dickinson was my composition teacher. I said not was, he still is, because I'm still always asking him questions. And he's the one who told me. He said, "Listen, man, you need to really think about this because you have the opportunity of being a jazz musician, bringing that language and notating it for the orchestra, right?" So that's what I've been doing, you know, with the film work and then with this opera. But the interesting thing becomes where, you know, you bring in some of these rhythmic phrases, you bring in some of these harmonic things, you bring in some of these things from my other world, and it becomes a struggle for the orchestra, right? And I was having a conversation with this friend of mine who teaches at Berkeley, and he's a great conductor as well and composer. And I was telling him, I said, "Hey man, should I modify?" And he, before I could even finish, he said, "No, no." He said, "You have to tell your story. You know, why are we going to adjust for something that's almost telling us not to be here?" You know what I mean? So if I'm going to come into this realm, I'm going to bring all of my background and my language. So when you were talking about the cadence, to me that's extremely important because that's rhythm, right? That's syncopation. That's going to be different from Puccini, and it should be, right? Because when I listen to Puccini, I get inspired. I love his music and I love what he did, but I hear it in context, you know? So the thing that's interesting today, you can go pick up a movie from the 40s and you just listen to the actors speaking English, but the rhythm and the cadence of it is different because of the time frame from which it came from. So why do we avoid that? So with Champion, you know, I'm anal, and plus I like, you know, the whole thing about the room of self-doubt. My room of self-doubt was like a church. It was huge, you know, and I wanted to make sure I did everything right. So, and I'm doing it now. I'm working on another opera now. I'm going through the same thing where I read the scenes over and over and over again, over and over and over again. And as I'm reading it, I want it to sound natural, just like it's coming off of my voice, like I'm speaking it, right? So once I'm reading it, I write out rhythms first. I don't write out notes. I have a whole notebook of the libretto just with rhythms, because I think that that's extremely important to make it sound like it's coming from us. You know, because my rhythmic sensibility of how I say things, just like when you said mirror. See, I know that. My wife's from D.C. I get it. Yeah. So I get it. As soon as you said that, I started thinking, oh, I feel like some crabs. But the thing about it is, even with me saying it in my dialect, being from New Orleans, I think it's very important to how it'll shape the overall texture and color and rhythm and syncopation of what it is that I do. Now,
Can I ask you a question too?
Sure.
Had you worked with this librettist before?
Yes, not as a librettist. The librettist for Champion is a film director. We did two films together. We did Gia and we did Original Sin. And I knew he was a great writer. And but his same thing for him. That's the first time he had written a libretto, and he comes from the comedy world. Yeah. So coming from the comedic world, it's all about economy for them. So that's why this libretto was actually kind of tight in terms of the number of pages that he had written. But he was getting right to the point, though. There was no hemming and hawing with him. But sure.
And then the topic itself for Champion, so of the boxer. Just whose idea was that? Where did that originate? Was that, I'm going to write a libretto about a boxer, a black boxer, and, you know. How did this come together? What came first?
Well, when they first asked me to do the opera, they wanted me to think about doing an opera about Hurricane Katrina. And this is 2013, and one of the things that I remember back then is that being from New Orleans, you know, there was a TV show on HBO called Treme, and when it was premiered, there were a bunch of parties around the city because a lot of people were excited about the possibilities of seeing New Orleans being the host of something like that after the success of The Wire. But the interesting thing about it was, I remember being at my friend's house. He, laid out a spread. We'd gather, we would joking and laughing around, and blah, blah, everybody's really happy. And then the show started. And when it started, there was just silence because, it's still very close and very real for us, right? So I didn't want to deal with that topic like that. I said, man, we still got a lot of healing and stuff to do. I don't want to bring us back to that space. So I started thinking about it. My best friend is, his name is Michael Bent. He's actually a heavyweight champion. I always said he beat Tommy Morrison. You can go Google it for the championship. And he had told me about the story of Emil Griffith. And then I got the book 9, 10 and Out. And I think the thing that struck me about Emil's story is that Mike, he kept telling me, he said, man, he really was a sweet dude. He's a sweet guy, really nice guy. And then I thought about everything that he went through, being a sweet person. Why is it that some people won't accept him? Are you not accepting him just because of his sexuality? That's unfortunate. And then I also thought about, and I tell this story all the time, I also thought about, the first time I won a Grammy Award, and you don't think about it, it's something that happens. They call your name, and automatically I just turn to my wife and give her a hug and a kiss, right? And then I go up and receive my award. Well, what got me about that was I could do that with somebody that I love. I could share that moment openly with somebody that I love, and nobody would even think twice about it. Well, to think that this guy became welterweight champion of the world and still had to hide that side of his life, it's silly to me. It was silly. We got other things we need to be worried about. We don't need to be worried about who loves who. That's his business. That's his, not mine. So I kept thinking, and then at the same time that we were doing it, there were some basketball players who had come out, and after we did the opera, there was another football player who would come out, and we started to see this emergence where people were starting to speak freely about it. And we kept thinking, listen, this is an opportunity to deal with an issue that should help people heal and grow, and anything that I do in my art form, that's what I want to do. I'm not saying there's anything wrong for doing things just for the sake of music, but that's just not who I am as a person, and that's fine. We all shouldn't do the same thing, but I couldn't, with my own conscience, just walk away from that topic. But in doing that, I think it's important to really stress how in the art world, we always want to broaden an audience, but we don't want to listen to the audience. We want to broaden an audience by saying, we want to broaden an audience by saying, you need to come to me. And that's arrogant. It's extremely arrogant. And I think it's high time that we start to broaden ourselves and say, listen, what is it that people want to see? What is it that people need to see and need to hear? So looking at your piece, just the small snippet of it, I'm going, right, exactly. That's what should be happening. It's not, just like my piece and just like Janine's piece, it's not the end all, it's the part of. It's pieces of the whole. And the beautiful thing about it for me as an artist, I've gotten inspired just by listening to these things that I've heard here today, right? Because it doesn't fall into the same old narrative. Because you guys, just in this little bit of time that we spend together, have opened my eyes to some other things, And when I get back to writing, I know it's going to have an effect on what it is that I do, which it should, which also should have an effect on the people who come in here and experience it. The sad thing about Champion to me is that so many people are being impacted by it. And I mean that in a positive way. It's a sad thing because it's like people are going, finally. And I hate that. I know they've shown it to me as a compliment, but I hate the fact that it's taken this for people to come out and say, to take a breath and go, wow. And because the next step for me in my logical thinking is that, okay, well, I don't want this to be the exception to the rule. This needs to be a turning point in the development of opera. And for me, what I would hope is that people in the operatic world will look at the success of Champion and go, okay, and listen, we all want to work, trust me, so I'm not telling people not to hire me. I'm not saying that, you know what I mean? I'm not doing that. But, you know, you would hope that the success of Champion would say, hey, who else is out there? Who has something to say?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for asking that, Paige. It was the perfect time to ask it, and now I don't have to. No, please. Yes. That's why I've so much enjoyed this forum, because it really is always illuminating and enlightening to hear the creators behind the work to talk about their process, right? Because I often think, again, folks like me are tasked or take the task up of, you know, trying to figure out, but it's really useful for us to be able to have this open dialogue in this space that's always also connected to an actual institution of music, right? That has the possibility to create some sense of invitation and change. So I actually want to segue into a very clear sort of statement that'll, I think I want to move through your piece, and then maybe, we'll play by ear. What's going on there? And so then we also have the excerpt from Champion. But I do want to just kind of make clear, I think that what our creators are presenting to us is this idea of what it means to really engage with music democratically, right? And how music as a democratic process can also reflect our social processes and relations and how we function as individuals in society, right? But that takes what work, right? So the work that you all are doing as composers and creators and directors and librettists, right? Just creatively on its own, also has to be done in relation to institutions that are frankly hostile to certain relations of change, period, but especially change that has to do with change that is completely usurping in many ways their ideas that have been invested in creating this social space in the first place, right? And so with that being said, I want to just make clear that it is actually the duty of the institutions themselves to find ways and figure out ways to be inclusive. There is no lack of Black composer. We have, in addition to our panel here, we have Courtney Bryan, who is a dear friend and colleague of mine, who's in the audience as well, and also Professor Tulane and composer. I can name 4 or 5 different composers and librettists working on operas now. Young composers of color, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, you know. And so again, it is the responsibility of the institutions to do this work. Otherwise, they actually are not interested in doing this work. It's about opportunity, right? And so the opportunity is there, and we cannot continue to feed the narrative that it's too difficult or that their work is not out there, because they're both not true.
Okay, that's a whole nother topic. We could do a whole show on that, because it doesn't just exist with the composers and the creators of the work. It also exists with the performers of the work. You know, because, you know, all too often what Champion has done, Champion has introduced, wherever it's gone, it's introduced the companies to people in their communities that's been there the entire time. You know what I'm saying? So, and it's like, it's really interesting because I'm sitting there, you know, saying to myself, so now you've had this experience and it's been a positive one. What happens after this? I'm not the only person who can write an opera. I know that. And I know there are probably people who can write opera way more effectively than me. It's about opportunity. And one of the things that I see is that I see other people getting opportunities, but what we have to understand socially is that while their talent is out there, listen, man, I was lucky. I was lucky enough for somebody to say, come here, do this, let me show you this, boom, boom. There are a bunch of kids out there that don't have that, but they have the ability. So it is incumbent upon us to reach out to them and to say, hey man, I see you have talent. Let's put you in a forum or put you in a workshop and let's see what can happen. It doesn't mean that everything is going to work, you know what I mean? But we are probably going to find those little gems that are out there waiting to tell their story. You know, in my film career, Marcus Mill and myself, we make a joke, whenever we're hanging around each other, we always say we can't be in the same building at the same time. Because if they blow it up, there goes 2/3 of the black film composers, because it's only Stanley Clark, Marcus and myself. And we say it as a joke because we know there are other people out there that have the ability to do it. Yeah, I mean, to think about Karen Slack and the ability that this woman has to convey emotion to an audience. She brought the house down, last night, and to think that she is not a household name is a tragedy. To think of Arthur Woodley, who Lauren Moselle told him to his face, if you weren't a person of color, your name would be on everybody's lips. Those are the realities that we're dealing with in this art form. And I always find it fascinating because when Champion went to the Kennedy Center, there was one guy who wrote a review about Champion, and he says, I've been covering this for 30 years, and I've never seen this much of a diverse audience at the Kennedy Center for an Opera. So, okay, that's a great thing to talk about. But what do you do to keep that moving forward? Because when is the next time African-American composer or somebody else, Latino, somebody else who's going to have a performance at the Kennedy Center? When is that opportunity going to come about?
What would you say to that? Is there a solution? I feel like I've been posed that question, but as a creator, I know what I can do. I know what I can do best, what I can crank out. But what would you tell an organization, an institution to do next steps in terms of keeping the audience that you just cultivated?
The truth. The truth is, the truth is that, you have to get over yourself. You do. I had to get over myself as a jazz musician. I did. I had to stop saying, oh man, I'm trying to be like Miles Davis. No. Because the thing is, when I met Miles, I realized I'm never going to be him. And I realized the reason why people gravitated toward his music and Wayne Shorter's music is because they were being themselves and being real and being honest. So one of the things I love about, and I feel very blessed, and I say this all the time, I feel very blessed to start my career with Opera Theater St. Louis, because what they are trying to do is address this issue head on. They said it. They didn't have no bones about it. They said, listen, man, we want to try to bring a diverse audience to opera. That's why we come to you, an African-American composer who writes for orchestra and who's a jazz musician. I don't have a problem with that. I look at that as an opportunity, right? So I know that they're looking for other opportunities like that as well. So that's why they have with their Young Arts program. They go out, a lot of young African-American opera singers have gone through their program. So people have to start looking around and stop saying what opera was. It's never going to be that again. Let it go. It's never going to be that again. Listen, man, I long for the days when I could go in the club and hear John Coltrane play, and then next door would be Sonny Rollins, and all that. Listen, when you hear guys talk about that history, I go, man, that's amazing. It's never going to happen again. It's never. But that doesn't mean that something beautiful isn't going to happen. And we have to start to open our eyes to things that we may not understand at first. That's the thing that I love about teaching. I love to teach because when you give students the tools, and this is why I know this whole thing you were talking about composers is true. When you give these students the tools to understand how to craft and develop musical ideas, the stuff that they come up with is amazing. I mean, I make a joke about it. Sometimes the guys write some stuff and I say, hey, bro, if you hear something like that sound on, if you hear something on my album that sounds like your tune, it's just coincidence. No, because, so my thing about this is what we need to do. First of all, is do what we're doing right now and speak truth to power all the time. And sit down and say, hey, man, there's some people out there that got something to say. They have something to say, and they know how to do this. And if they don't know how to do this, find the people to help them learn. That's what Opera Theater St. Louis did for me. That's another thing. Opera Theater, they knew I could write for orchestra, but they didn't, listen, and in terms of the artists, don't come here with an ego. Put that aside. So I put my ego aside. I told them, I said, hey man, I don't know how to do this. And they said, listen, they literally grabbed me by the hand and stepped me through the process, step by step. We'd have workshops. And when we had workshops with these students, it was a great experience for them. And I walked into the first workshop and I told the students, I said, hey man, listen, I'm gonna tell you right now, this is the first time I'm writing something for voice. First time I'm definitely writing an opera. So if there's anything that you see that I need to check out, please have no reservations about raising your hand and opening up your voice. And there was this moment of silence. And then I learned later on, they kept telling me that never happens. Well, see, that's arrogant in my mind on composers. It's an arrogant thing for some composer to come in and say, oh, I'm so-and-so, sing what I wrote. No. When you were talking, the interesting thing about when you were talking about the aria with Karen, the thing that I want to say about that is, it's interesting that you pointed that one out, because to me, that performance and what happened speaks to the idea of collaboration, of what it truly is. Because when I wrote it, it was supposed to be like something for Ella Fitzgerald and Ray Brown. Far away, long ago, boom, bing, ding, gong, ding, gong, ding, but it was supposed to have a pulse like that, right? Well, when Denise started singing it, she kept saying, I need to be able to, breathe with it. And I said, okay. And then when Karen came, she said the same thing. She said, I want to take my time, and I'm like, fine. Because for me, I don't know. This is my first rodeo with this. And to watch what happened as a result of saying, hey, go do your thing, right? Open my eyes and created this something that you were talking about, because I never thought about it like that, but I'm glad you said that. Well, you see the two worlds come together. And they came together in such a way where both were equally bringing something to the table, so to speak, right? So that's what I see in your piece too, the same thing. So we need to, and here's the other thing too about this. It's kind of like what's happening in the country. You're gonna sink or swim. You're gonna sink or swim. Either you wanna hold on to something and suffer the consequences, or you wanna move forward and give other people opportunities to bring new vision and new ideas to the genre.
Thank you so much for that. And yes. So we want to make sure to be able to have an opportunity to hear the excerpt from Champion, and so as we can prepare and ask our amazing performers to prepare for that rendition. Yes. So Ivan Griffin is going to return to sing. To sing What Makes a Man from Champion, which was again premiered last night at the New Orleans Opera. Not its first premiere, but premiered here. And then I also thank you, Paige, for your question, which is a really wonderful and thoughtful question around, what would you say, what would Terrence, what would you say to that, right? This is why I'm very excited to be working along with the producer of this forum, Christopher Power, as well as the general and artistic director, Francesca Zambello, because what also has to happen, these institutions have to invest.
Yes.
And as you said, if one does not know how to do something, one has to ask. And then one also has to know that asking comes with, like anything else, it's a service, right? And so there's ideas, of course, around ticket sales and sustaining a house and paying the bills and keeping the lights on, right? But if as you mentioned, we're moving, demographics have changed. Hopefully people's social morals have changed and are changing over time. And we are at a very clear moment, right, where you are on one side or the other. And so if one does not find an investment to be central to your articulation in inclusion, then one is actually speaking to exactly what side they find themselves on. Right. And so with that being said, wonderful to go to transition into our performance of Champion here by Ivan Griffin. Thank you very much.
What makes a man a man? What makes a man the man he is? Is it the flesh and bone inside, outside? Is it the skin he wears? days, or worry dreams of fertile moral days. Inside, outside, there is a heart I know somewhere inside. You hear it beat, you hear it sing. It cries and talks to you and tells you what you feel is what you feel inside. It makes you strong, or does it make you weak outside? There is a soul I know somewhere inside. You feel it pull, you feel it lift, it carries you and takes you where you know you have to go and love, and love is in this heart and in this soul. It makes you strong inside, or does it make you weak inside, outside? And somewhere there where love is living, there is a man who is the man I am inside, the man I am and outside, outside. This man that all the world can see, who is this man? Who is this man who calls himself a me? There was no sound. There were no people I could see. In my head, the place was empty. There was no one there but me.
Thank you again, Ivan and Michael, for that excerpt, What Makes a Man, from Terrence Blanchard's Champion. And before we launch into Q&A from our audience, I would like to give you a opportunity to give us a little bit more, a few more thoughts on Champion, and particularly this excerpt. And I think that one of the things that's really powerful about this work, as I'm continuing to get to know it, and I'm very excited to see it tomorrow, is again, Paige, you brought up this idea of intersectionality, right, which is a term developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, legal scholar, who notes that there are different levels of experience that individuals have based on the different levels of identities that they carry in their bodies. And so this also, again, is bringing to question sexuality, it brings to question gender, it brings to question race, it brings to question class, it brings to question region, and also how these things impact the actual person who has to experience inhabiting this space, that body in society, right? And so it can resonate. We talked about, how do you bring an audience in with topics? There's so many ways in which it's going to resonate to different folks, right? And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about this this particular excerpt, and then also your process of actually setting this even more within the operatic context and your sort of musical choices there.
Well, one of the things about all of these pieces, when you start talking about all of the things that exist in the stories, is that, you know, we know this intellectually, but we keep forgetting it socially. We're all complex beings. We all have so many things that are just not black and white in our lives. There are a lot of different shades. And that's the thing that I related to in Emil's character, or Emil as a person, I should say. And this particular excerpt comes at a moment in time where, you know, in the boxing world at that time, a lot of people in the media knew that Emil was gay, but they didn't write about that. It wasn't about sensationalizing that. That was his private business. And Benny Paret and him had fought twice before, and each won a fight. And Benny was trying to gain some kind of leverage mentally over him, and he outed him in a press conference. You know, the interesting thing about that scene is that the scene comes right off of the press conference where his trainer is basically saying, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to know that. You know, trying to conceal the issue and just run away from it and not even deal with it, right? And at that moment, you know, we look at that moment as one of those reflective moments in Emil's life where he's alone and he's questioning himself. It's like, man, listen, you know, I've risen to the ranks, through the ranks of the boxing world. You know, in terms of our social identities, you can't classify me being more of a male than that, right? And even with that, that's still not enough for you. So just because you learned of this other side of my personality, which you haven't experienced. So there had to be moments where he sat down and said to himself, well, what makes a man a man? What is it? Is it the way he walks? Is it the color of his voice? Is it, you know, what happens? Because, you know, I'm dealing with all of these issues, you know, and I'm still a person. So, again, when I wrote that, I spoke it a lot, you know, and that's why it breaks down to inside, outside. Is it that? Is it this? And truth be told, when I'm writing it, you're feeling the angst of the story, and that starts to dictate to me pitch, you know, where things go and how, at what moment should they happen. The thing at the end where he says there was no sound or there were no people I could see, you know, that's him trying to find some resolution to this, you know. So those are all of the things that kind of push you in a direction to write it, you know. Roger Dickinson always used to tell me, he says, man, if being a composer, you have to learn how to listen, because the story is telling you what it is all the time, but your ego is saying, no, but I like this sound, I like this rhythm, and I like this harmony. Well, you know, you have to learn how to put those things aside and let the story itself say, okay, no, this is what I feel. This is what's going on. Because it's speaking to you all the time, you know. And the thing that I always try to tell my students, learning how to be a composer is really learning the craft so you can learn how to tell stories. You don't learn the craft to regurgitate the craft. You know what I mean? We all do it, you know, when we first start to write. Everybody does it. You know, the classic example for me was I was a big fan of The Rite of Spring. And I remember when Spike called me to do Jungle Fever, which was going to be the first film that I'd ever written. Man, I went back, I pulled out my scores to The Rite of Spring, and I was taking out notes, and I was like, oh man, all this rhythmic stuff I've been, ooh, this is going to be here. You know? And then I got out the movie, and I went, well, I can't use none of that. So that's when you have to learn how to understand that these things are beyond us, you know. And I've always feel blessed about my experiences in life, because my initiation into the jazz world was playing with Art Blakey. But he called this group Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. You know what I mean? So, and that's always stuck with me. So that also put me in the mindset of, this is beyond us. We are mere vessels to help humanity grow and heal in other ways. You know what I mean? So I'm just here to do my part, you know, in terms of creating work that will help other people, inspire them to go out and do their part.
Thank you all so much. What a rich conversation, dialogue, and also experience of sounds we've had in this short amount of time today. But I would like to open up to our audience if any of you all have any questions for our panelists. Please, would you actually mind coming up so because we're recording live here? Oh, okay, I'll repeat it then. Good idea. Okay, I'll repeat your question.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
You want me to do it from here?
Yes.
Okay. I have a question for Paige, and it's only because I met Paige in Billings, Montana in 2014. Okay, I was an education director for Brickberry Theater then, and Paige brought a wonderful autobiography to the theater. It's called Paige in Full. And so she brought this to the theater, and then she did a teaching workshop out in a number of our regional schools. Well, ironically, now we both kind of come full circle because I'm education director here for the opera, and we're working on a program called Hip Opera. And so I would just like to really quickly, I don't want to take too much time from other folks that want to ask questions, but were we able to maybe perhaps figure out a collaboration with you? How would that work in the classroom? In other words, like right now, I've got kids out in the schools that are doing this project Hip Opera. We're taking tunes and we're altering them, tunes meaning from actual operas, and we're changing them to add a hip hop component. But now you've got this entire new piece. Yeah. So I'm just wondering what kind of cool possibilities.
Yeah, sure.
For you to bring at some point maybe if we could collaborate on this piece.
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, what's interesting, well, your question for the live stream is just about education, outreaches, connections you can make in the classroom or for younger audiences. Yeah. The fantastic thing about developing Stomping Grounds at Glimmerglass is that our tester audience was actually middle and high school students throughout New York. So we started in a tour through upstate New York, where we did everything from like Cooperstown and Albany and Syracuse and Oneonta, and then we went into the city, into the Bronx and Manhattan. These varied. I'm just giving you this background because there's so many things you can do. But I was going to say this varied in terms of exposure that the students had to opera. So sometimes it was all black audiences, sometimes it was all white audiences. It varied in terms of class and gender and just accessibility. And what we found is that no matter what, the entire spectrum, this piece spoke to them. They found access points in different ways. So just in the fact that it was merging hip hop, which is always been and continues to be the language of the youth and of the underserved, there's relatability, there's freshness, there is an approach, there's a style. These are all these things that really allow the students to see that not only is this representation, but this is them, that it's authentic, that it speaks to them in a way that they understand, that it validates them, and also that they just begin to understand that there are different options out there. So we were able to kind of get all of that firsthand. There were students who tapped in because they knew the hip hop references. There were students who never saw opera before but attempt to do her notes with her. So things like that. Then there was the whole movement aspect of it. How can movement best assist opera or memorization? We were able to make STEM connections to it because there's things embedded in the music that are just math, that are just algebra, that are just patterns. So it's chock full. I think that's the great thing about both of our operas and Blue as well, because I've read Blue's libretto, is that it comes from a place that, again, is very authentic, that speaks to specific audiences, but is also universal. So there's different access points and entryways to make sure that it's something that, you know, everybody can kind of tune into and relate to and learn different things from. And there's just themes. There's themes across all of these operas that I think are very mature and timely, and for younger audiences specifically. I mean, I don't know if you've been able to do any kind of outreach for younger audiences with your theme and your topic matter, but like, you know, what was crazy about going and touring in upstate is that there was a huge refugee population. I mean, it was just like, so that was another way that we could talk to, another angle we could work with. So there's all kinds of ideas. Almost you can say what your need is, and I'm sure we could meet it, because it's just that chock full. Yeah, thanks, William.
When we premiered the opera in St. Louis, we did a lot of outreach, and we would go into the schools. And one of the programs that I loved was we went into this elementary school, and we encouraged these kids to write and tell their stories. And we brought in a young artist from the area. He had a studio, and when these kids brought in these poems, we took them to the studio and put it to music. And when I tell you to see what they wrote brought tears to everybody's eyes. It's one young lady, she must have been 11 or 12 years old, and she must have been bullied. And she started talking about the whole thing of wanting to belong and feeling outside of everything that was going on. And the words were just phenomenal. And I think I'm really happy to see what you guys are doing in terms of that in New Orleans, because I've always said after Hurricane Katrina, there are kids here who need to heal and have something to say. Giving them the space and the genre to do it is the most important thing. So hopefully with what you guys are doing will arise some person or persons who can really speak to what it is that they're dealing with, you know, because, you know, as grown people, we have our own issues, but those kids have gone through something very traumatic, and I know out of that can come something that's beautiful and helpful as well.
I think we might have time for one more question. Yes, please.
Yes, so my name is Taylor White. I'm a vocal student here, but I wanted to ask you, so one, I appreciate that we're sitting in a space where we're talking about, I think, these revolutionary things in terms of different genres of music. And so part of my question was, we study these composers and these librettists, and these are like the foundations on which we build these different things, but I think sometimes what we don't think about is when these people were alive and were doing what they were revolutionary at the time when they were writing. So how do you express that to someone who isn't against change now, but is still afraid of it?
Great question. So I'll let you all respond.
Well, the question is, how do you bring something new to people who are not against change but are afraid of it? And I think, you know, one of the things you have to do is constantly speak your truth. You need to know how many times my students have helped me grow. You know, when I wasn't looking for that, I was walking into the classroom trying to offer what it is that I had to offer, and in the process walked out with more than what I offered them. So it's a touchy thing, and sometimes you may have to come to the conclusion that that person is not ready yet, and you have to just walk in your truth and do your thing and do, you know what I mean? Because you cannot all the time turn people around. You know what I mean? An example that I'll give you is that there have been even with my father wanted me to be a classical musician, and you know, while I was a renegade trying to play this jazz, and you know, he wasn't feeling that, right? It took years later after I had made, there was a moment in time when my father said, "You're not my son," because I left school to go play with Art Blakey, and that broke my heart. But I felt like I had to do what I had to do because I understood the significance of playing with Art Blakey, right? Well, it wasn't until years later after that I come home with my first album that I'd done with Art Blakey, and oddly enough, the title of the album was My Tune, right, that I'd written while I was here in high school. And he took it to one of his friends, who was a musician, Clem Turvalon, a great trombone player. And he helped my dad to understand what was going on. And then my dad, to his credit, came back and apologized to me. And he said, I'm proud of you. And he said, because if you would have listened to me, you would probably still be in New Orleans, not doing what it is that you really were here to do. So people come to their own things in their own time. You know what I'm saying? Now, I'm not telling you to be confrontational. I'm not telling you not to listen to whatever it is that they have to offer. Because even though my father wasn't ready for that, he still had plenty of things to offer me that I still took from him, because I understood where his frame of reference, where he was coming from. You know, an example I'll give you of that is that, you know, when I was a kid, my cousin started playing the drums, and he would play the James Brown beat, and my father came in and started playing 4/4 on the bass drum, 2/4 on the hi-hat, and we thought that was funny, right? And he got up and he said, "You guys don't want to learn anything," you know, and we laughed, you know, and he stormed out of the room, and we left there cracking up. I must have been about 10 years old at the time, right? So imagine my shock that I'm 19 years old. I just got the gig with Art Blakey. I remember it. It was in Strasbourg, France. And we started playing a tune that I'd heard Art Blakey play on record a whole bunch of times, but I never really paid attention to what was going on. The moaning, and then the bridge goes da da dee dee, and then the bridge goes da da dee 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 dee. I couldn't play my part. I was like, damn, look at that. That's what my dad was telling me about. You know what I mean? So it goes both ways, because the thing that I don't want you to do, I don't want you to be at a point where you will not get what you need to get because you want to make this point. You know what I'm saying? So the reality of it is that we're all imperfect. We're all a God's creation, and we all come to things in our own moments in time. So just live your truth, but don't deny their truth, whatever it is they're trying to offer you.
Sure. To that I say, create your own work. Like, do you. You have to just do the work. That has been everything about my success. This commission is just one of a dozen that I've been commissioned, but it's because I created my own work. And I put it out there as a model, as an example, to show folk that I could break a mold and be well executed, and it be successful, and it be something that they want to be a part of. But I had to get it out too. The other thing is, you know, you play the game. So I have a theater background. My degree is in theater and broadcast journalism. And it's the same in the theater world, you know, like your Molieres and your Shakespeare. But I learned it all, and I got masterful at it so that I could break the mold. Do you know what I'm saying? So I could like come at them with the same things and then say, yeah, it's just like, you know, in that Harold Pinter piece. It's just like in, you know what I mean? And be able to talk the talk and speak their own game just so I can manipulate it and change it. But it only came from creating my own work.
If we can thank our really amazing and wonderful panelists, Janine Tesori, Paige Hernandez, and Terrence Blanchard, for this amazing dialogue, as well as our performers, Christina Hicks, Ivan Griffin, and accompanist Michael Borowitz. Thank you very much for your renditions. We would also like to give a closing thanks to Robert Lyle, the General and Artistic Director of the New Orleans Opera, the staff of the New Orleans Opera and Xavier University, as well as to Christopher Powell, who is the producer of Breaking Glass for the Glimmer Glass Festival, and the General and Artistic Director, Francesca Zambello. And this particular forum is funded by grants provided by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and Opera America. Thank you all also to our virtual audience who is in attendance. Hello also to my mom and grandma. And thank you all very much. All right, thanks very much. Take care.